everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We definitely appreciate your attendance. Our session today is Your Data is Talking. Are you listening? Throughout this presentation, as I've mentioned for the folks of you who came on early to the line, we are going to be recording this session for you, but as well, we're going to be monitoring the chat line. So if you have any questions along the way, we're happy to answer those. We're also going to have some time at the end of this session to go through any questions that you may have. With this presentation, we definitely want to get your wheels spinning on how you can start using your data more effectively, if you're not already. But we also want to provide some advanced reporting tips for those of you who are already using your reporting. So to get started, I'd like to introduce myself. I've always found it's great to put a face with a name. Sorry, everyone, having technical difficulty with the presentation. All right, there we go. So my name is Sandra Jensen. I am one of the co-founders of Kell Partners. Our co-founder and my business partner is Kevin Burpo. While going through this presentation, I'll be delivering the presentation and going through the slides, and Kevin's going to be the one monitoring the chat for your questions and be able to answer those questions as we review the presentation. So feel free to type any questions you have along the way. We'll also have some time at the end of the presentation for any questions that you have. Just to give you a little background on myself, I've been working with software as a service technology and nonprofit organizations for the last 10 years. I've also been working with other organizations as well, but for the past 10 years, I've really had a primary focus on working with nonprofits in higher education. Working with technology and nonprofits is definitely a passion of mine, and I'm very fortunate to get to do something that I love every single day. Before founding Kell with Kevin, I worked for several technology companies like America Online, BMC Software, Convio, and People Admin. In addition to working with the nonprofit organizations as a consultant, I'm also a board member for Texas School for the Deaf, a longtime donor and volunteer for places like Goodwill Industries, Capital Area Food Bank, and Blue Dog Rescue. I will eventually figure out how to click through the slides, so one moment while we go through this technical difficulty. Okay, so to give you a little more information about Kell Partners, we were founded in 2008 with a really clear mission. We wanted to make technology simple and accessible to nonprofit organizations. Our logo and tagline is Technology and Simplified, and that's definitely what we aim to do. Kevin and I have spent the last 8+ years working together with nonprofit and higher education customers before starting Kell. And of course, it's not just the two of us. We also have a team of 20 folks that build the Kell team. And these include strategic consultants, project managers, data architects, and designers. We're definitely a full-service shop, and we like to offer our customers a gamut of solutions. Just like Kevin and I, our team is really passionate about working with nonprofit organizations, and most of them have come directly from a nonprofit organization. They're typically referred to as the tech folks, and now they're working as the tech folks for our organizations and helping nonprofits. Throughout our careers, we've worked with just over 700 nonprofit organizations and 500 higher education clients. And at Kell, we've served just over 350 clients as an individual company. We try to be really flexible to meet our clients' needs. For this reason, we have 25 technology vendors in place to make the right technology fit at the right time for our customers. Some of these include Salesforce.com, Convio, Vertical Response, Wealth Engine, Bill Highway. We've also worked to convert customers from over 20 different databases and solutions. Some of these include Razor's Edge, eTapestry, and Donor Perfect, as well as donor databases like Access, FileMaker, and Excel. Lastly, our corporate headquarters is in Austin, Texas, but we have satellite offices in San Francisco and also in Dallas. So now that we have introductions out of the way, let me get started by telling you a little bit about how I developed this presentation. So I'm inspired by a lot of things. I'm constantly inspired by the customers I work with, of course, and I also am inspired by the great work that they do for their mission. as a consultant working with nonprofits, I really try to stay current so I can help out our customers. And so I find myself reading a lot of blogs by great folks like Beth Cantor and Kurt Volkler. If you haven't taken a look at their blogs, I definitely recommend that you do so. I also follow Holly Ross a lot with NTEN, as I always find that she has some insightful tips and tricks for nonprofit organizations and shares them on a steady basis. So recently, I was watching a presentation that Melinda Gates gave at TED Talk. She was talking about what nonprofits can learn from for-profit businesses like Coca-Cola, or maybe in her case, like Microsoft. It boiled down to really 3 main points. 1, use real-time data to immediately improve what you're doing. 2, use and acquire local entrepreneur talent. And 3, market your mission. So I really started to ponder the first point, use real-time data. The truth is, your data can tell a story. From campaign results to constituent interests to areas for operational improvement, it can really inform your mission's work, and it can help your organization raise money, get more constituents, and gain more control over your campaigns and projects. But what I found is you have to be listening to the data and what the data is telling you, and perhaps most importantly, you need to be listening all the time. As Melinda Gates pointed out in her session, nonprofits often analyze data at the end of a project instead of throughout the execution of a project. I work with a lot of organizations, often helping them implement and optimize their software and their solutions. And I found with this, I work with them to collect various types of data. And I see on a pretty regular basis that when you capture and use your data, it really can help you run your organization and your mission more effectively and serve your mission more effectively as well. So here are some ideas to get you started. Ideally, you should really consider the use of your data as part of the planning phase before any project or campaign. While it's really common to rely on gut instinct, it's also really important to have solid data to help you further your mission. So I work with a lot of the customers that I have to, really change for them from becoming an organization that is just relying on gut instinct to an organization that is a data-derived organization. Now, this isn't to say that gut instincts don't play a huge part in what we do, but I think it's always important to combine that intuition with some data that's telling you more specific information about your organization. So I think, before starting any major program or campaign, you should at least have a general idea of what data you'll collect, what you'll use that data for, how you'll collect it, and when you'll collect it. So this type of planning is really second nature to for-profit companies, which must constantly increase their margins and profit in order to meet shareholder demands. But as a nonprofit professional, the extra planning and record keeping involved may seem a little daunting or even wasteful. To you, it may mean spending time on the business side of things instead of spending time on your mission. So for this session, we really want to talk about how you can use data to paint a picture for you to share, how you can visualize your data to create content for storytelling, how you can learn to deliver data at the right time to the right audience, how you can shift to becoming that data-derived organization that I talked about instead of just relying on your instinct, what tools are available to help you, and perhaps more importantly, how you measure your success. So as a reminder, if you have questions along the way, Kevin will be monitoring the chat session during this presentation to answer those questions, and we'll also have the time at the end of the session to answer any live questions that you may have. Of course, we're available for individual follow-up after this presentation as well. So, like most nonprofits, you're probably capturing data in many different silos. It's very typical to have data in your accounting system, email tools, getting stats from direct mail houses perhaps. You might also be capturing data already in things like Google Analytics, capturing volunteer information in Excel, and sometimes even pen and paper We do this ourselves. But even though some of these tools have built-in reporting, a lot of our customers aren't quite sure where to get started, and once they have gotten started, perhaps what metrics are most important ones that they should be focusing on when building out the reporting toolkit. So before we get started and talking about common data collection points, let's talk about goals for a bit, as it's impossible to really define our measurements without having goals in place. So some of your goals may be that you'd like to increase your membership by 10%, boost donations by 20%, sign up 50 new volunteers, growing your net income to support another employee or 2 other employees, or sometimes simply just increasing the average amount of your donation. It is important to always weigh these metrics, and I talk to customers a lot about this, and weighing out, producing these metrics versus the time that it took you to produce them. One of the things that we help our customers start doing is building out their toolkit so they have these reports accessible and can be used at any time, and they aren't spending a lot of time preparing for their board presentations or pulling these reports, during their campaigns to compare them. So most nonprofits do know about common data collection points. What they don't always understand is what data to track for each of these points, and then after you're doing that, how to share the data to use it to really change your impacts and chart for your success. So why aren't you doing it? I think, it's just really easier said than done, right? So let's really review the different areas that you may want to report on as a nonprofit organization and start breaking those down. We're going to look at simple and some more complex metrics for 4 main areas. 1, fundraising. 2, communication. 3, programs. And lastly, everyone's favorite, of course, finance. So let's get started with what most organizations consider most important, fundraising. But let's start simply. Most of you are probably already tracking your donations raised and the number of donors. With some really simple division to these totals, you can expand this to capture your average donation amount if you're not doing this already. This is an important number to capture as it goes back to setting your goals. If you know where you are now, it's a lot easier to plot a path where you'd like to be. So if your average donation is $32, but you'd like this to be $40, you can start plotting your course to get you to your $40 average donation. I'm sure you're probably also tracking your individual donations now, but if you haven't spent time in developing your campaign codes, we really recommend this as a natural next step. A campaign in the simplest terms is, where did the donation come from? Where did the money come from? And we think this is important because you can start, measuring, each of your various campaigns and then seeing how my campaigns relate to each other and which ones are more successful. Did I receive this in response of a direct mail solicitation? Did it come as part of our annual giving campaign? This is a really, really important piece as it allows you to dive a little bit deeper and do the comparative reporting that is important so you can decide as an organization where your focus should be. And once you have this information down, it's really easy to start plotting yearly comparisons and change over time. So now that we have the basics of fundraising, let's look at some more complex reporting that you can look at in your system. As you begin getting more and more comfortable with fundraising data, it's pretty easy to spot trends. You can also begin to model your data and look for data anomalies that you may want to review with a little more of a fine-tooth comb. From here, we recommend always looking at LIBUNT and SciBunt. For those of you who haven't evaluated these metrics in the past, they are last year, but unfortunately not this year, and some year, but unfortunately not this year. These are really important metrics, and we stress this with our clients a lot, as it allows you to create campaigns with donors who have not only shown interest in the past, but statistically, they're more likely to get to your organization again. The exciting part about running a LIBUNT or a SciBunt report is that it points to easy money that you can raise right now. So if we look at research and philanthropy, we find that increasingly donors don't remember whether they've made their annual fund gift. I always like to give the advice to stay positive and assume that your LiveVent donors still love you as an organization, but they simply forgot to give, and they need a little reminder from you. And most importantly, if you ask them to give, they would give right now. And these are really important to track over time and, create reports where you're constantly looking at this data as you're constantly looking at revenue sources that you could go out and get for your organization right now. And then once you're ready to dive in a little bit more and get your hands dirty with the data, we do recommend looking at generational giving and channel comparisons together. So if we look at studies that are published, Convio did a study last year. It shows that you can plot generational givers and group them into matures, boomers, Generation X, and Generation Y. And if you were to do this, you would see a resistance of direct mail for the younger folks. But then as expected, matures have a tendency to get data via check, but also respond via direct mail. While you can't easily rely on published studies, in order for you to greater understand your constituents, we think it's important to understand their individual giving habits and then tailor your outreach towards the donor's preference. Until you're comfortable with extracting this data, I think it's really easy to rely on published reports and going with a bit of instinct. But once you are more comfortable, these are important things to look at. Finally, when tracking your grants holistically, we think it's important to really start creating a pipeline for your grants. So if I know that I'm going to apply for 10 grants this year, and based on my grant, kind of attach rate, if you will, in the past, then I can expect out of these 10 grants for, let's say, $100,000, that I can get $20,000 for my organization. And if you did this in 2011, then you can create your pipeline for 2012. And you can, say, okay, if I measure that and double it, then if I had a pipeline of applying for $200,000 in grants and I applied the same attach rate, then I can expect to get this much. And I think, really being able to forecast that, puts you to the spot where you can kind of, chart your success and your, how much you're going to be able to grow and serve your mission and your constituents for a longer term period. Now for communication, again, we recommend starting simple, but then building from there. So the easiest way to start collecting email data is just by looking at some of the reporting that you perhaps have built into your email tools. So most out-of-the-box marketing solutions like a vertical response or constant contact or eye contact or my Emma, they all come with built-in reports. So to start, we recommend just looking at these reports and really focusing in on open rates and response rates. Of the messages that you're sending out, how many folks are opening your email messages? Once they open it, what action are they taking next? If you also look at your web host, most built-in web hosts or web hosts have built-in reports that you can get to show how many folks are visiting your site. This is important because it helps you in measuring your impact and outreach as an organization. So how many folks am I touching on a daily basis, a weekly basis, even a monthly basis? How does that add up when I look at for the year? Once you become more comfortable with interpreting this type of data, you can really start to compare your pages. What pages are more popular? And then what pages perhaps aren't getting the traffic that I'd like to get? And this helps you have more awareness in the content that you're giving to your constituents and update that content to create more compelling content to pique their interest. If you haven't started using social media, we definitely encourage all of our customers to check this out. It's free and easy to get started with Facebook and Twitter, but remember, you can't just create a Facebook page or set up your Twitter account and expect folks to like you or to follow you. It's really important to provide regular updates and content for your followers. So we recommend by starting simply and just creating a schedule for you to update. Create an organizational schedule so everyone in your organization is supplying content and feeds for your followers. Once you have this down, you can start doing it on a monthly basis and defining everyone's impacts for the month. and then make a longer-term schedule so that you get into the habit with providing these updates and are looking at your social media outreach to increase your outreach as an organization. Once you are set up with Twitter and Facebook, they do provide built-in reporting so you can look at, what your counts are. How many folks are following you? How many folks are looking at your tweets? And then, we find that just looking at these on a monthly basis, we just want to make sure, is everything trending in the right direction? Are my Facebook friends going up? Are my Twitter followers increasing? And then also looking at other organizations perhaps that you'd like to follow or be friends with. So you can just continually increase your awareness. When you are a little more comfortable with the fundamentals of communication reporting, we do encourage you to dive in a little bit more. Time permitting, check out your website referrals, which simply means, how are folks getting to my site? What content compelled them to my site? What were they checking out before they arrived at my page? And with this, you can also try experimenting with Google AdWords. Once you are making monthly tweets, then you can go back and say, okay, what was retweeted? What content do your followers find especially interesting that they want to share with your friends or your followers? If your web host doesn't offer analytics for you, we definitely recommend that you check out what the smart folks at Google are doing. They do offer what's called Google Analytics. Like Facebook and Twitter, it's completely free to get started with Google Analytics. Beyond that, it's really easy to use, and it provides really detailed specifics about visitors to your website. Statistically, market share analysis says that Google has about 50% of the top 1 million websites. So I rely a little bit on gut instinct for that one and say, okay, if it's great enough for the top 50 websites, it's probably good enough for you and me. But I think this all goes back to, once you're tracking emails and once you're tracking, your web page, you can really start to establish your most predominant conversion path. And this is important because it helps you drive constituents down that same path so they become, change from showing interest in your organization to finding more about your organization to donating with your organization, becoming a volunteer, becoming someone who's a lifetime donor or a major volunteer, and continuing, down this path. So if you start seeing that, most of your constituents click through a link that they have been sent from an email, and then they go to the About Us page before donating, you can really learn to more effectively increase your email communication and direct people to a page that has really relevant details on your organization and that people in the past have shown the most interest in, and then you can have a really visible donate button. So it's an easy progression and conversion for them to become showing interest about a content and to being a donor for your organization. So lastly, we do think it's really important to segment your donors. So just as you learn about generational giving in response to channels, you can also really segment, your audience so that more and more you're delivering content that's based on their preferences and their selections. As for-profit organizations have found, people really like having more and more control over how they're contacted, when they are contacted, and how you're defining their interest or being able to define their own interest. So being able to effectively track this information and then use it when you're segmenting your audience will go a long way to not only better understanding your donors, but also giving them the sense that you're interested in them and that you understand their preferences. So for programs, again, we're going to start simple. We think for programs, you always want to look at your cost, not only your internal cost, but we also recommend charting your volunteer costs as well, perhaps separately. You also want to look at things such as equipment fees, location fees, materials, and once you're tracking your basic cost, you can then add in calculations for program funding and sponsorship, ticket sales and attendance, and using all of these items to include, to compute your margin. From this point, we think it's also really important when you're evaluating programs to measure your impact. What's the impact on the community? How many people did I touch with this? So, for example, How many people were fed this month? If I look at the long term, how many people was I able to feed this year? How many animals were placed into adoptive homes this week? And then how many in the last year? How many kiddos learned how to read? Once you have the basics in place, you can then really start comparing your programs. And this is important because you can decide, what program should I continue in and to invest in? What was our community impact? And this really, goes back to, if I'm comparing my programs, then I can look at, achieving the highest level of support, outreach, participation, and you can decide as an organization where's the best place to, put into all of our resources in order to achieve the most favorable outcome. Now, of course, for everyone's favorite, I know my personal favorite, not really, is finance. So for finance, again, we're going to start simple. So as I mentioned in the introduction, I do work with the Texas School for the Deaf Foundation. This organization is still a growing organization and spreading their wings, but they are really fortunate to have some board support in this area, as their chairman is also an accountant, which is very, very handy. Now, early on in their life cycle as a nonprofit, they've been, they were founded several years ago. They were really geared a lot towards their immediate needs, which was basically, how long can we keep this foundation running? How can we supplement our most mission-critical programs financially? As they've progressed a bit, and with the help of their board, they have been able to look longer term and to find out, how much funding do we need in order to get an executive director, which they were fortunate to add last year. How many grants can we expect once we have an executive director to focus on our grant program? Now I mentioned TSD is very lucky to have their chairman as an accountant. For those of you not as lucky, you can go ahead and start looking at year-over-year comparison. So in simple, how many donations did we get last year compared to how many we received this year? What was our profit versus our loss? How many donations did we think we were going to get last year, but how many did we actually get? Then really the most important financial piece to emerging organizations is, do we have everything we need to cover our costs and keep our doors open? Once you have that piece down, you really can start looking into, longer-term forecasting, projections, and comparison. And from there, you can work on creating your short-term goals and your long-term goals, and then use those to create even longer-term goals. We also recommend when you are goal setting to, not only have your immediate goals and short-term goals as well as your long-term goals, but you also establish stretch goals. So, because you always want to, have something for your organization to overreach or overachieve. And if you don't make your stretch goal, hey, you shot for the moon. But, you do have goals in place and you're constantly trying to achieve more as an organization. So I've just given you a lot of reporting and a lot of data, but now I think we get to with a lot of our customers, what's the best way to get started in all of this? I will say that once you do start capturing your data, it's really important to share your data. Data is only useful if it's shared. I know sometimes it's hard to part with that information, but we do encourage our clients to share this. We also really, really encourage them to use real-time data. I think too often, nonprofits will wait until the end of a program or a campaign to measure your success. So we always encourage folks when you're in the planning stage of a campaign. So let's say you plan on having a 6-month donation-centered campaign. Start easily by going, at the 3-month mark, we're going to stop and measure our process. So we're going to look at our channels, whether that be email marketing or direct mail marketing or, having our board members do phone solicitation. We're going to measure these channels and see which one had the most impact. From there, for the remainder of the 3 months that you have allotted for this campaign, you can really focus your energies on the places and the channels that have allowed you to get, the most bang for your buck, if you will. So, and I think, for the campaigns or the channels that aren't successful, it also allows you to go back to the drawing board. and really change your focus. If your email campaigns didn't work, perhaps it wasn't that email doesn't work for your constituents, but you need to change up your content a bit to create more compelling. So in that way, you can kind of connect it back to your website, and you can look at what was the most, out of all the information on my website, what data or page was looked at the most, and use that to really center your communication as that is the areas of your website that pique your constituents' level of interest, and then using that to tailor your email messages. And sometimes, we really think it's best just to let numbers speak for themselves. After all, numbers are, definitely a universal language. But we found that numbers can make a really big impression on your site and visitors. If you present your numbers in a really clear, concise way on your website, it has a really strong impact with people that are, viewing your page for the first time, or maybe even the 20th time. But users do need a grounding point to understand their data. They need something that's putting things into a perspective for them, and also something that they can relate to intuitively. So, you always want to use your data, but you want it to, share a story. We also recommend that as part of sharing your story and using data for your storytelling, put in some contextual data. So if the city has released studies with numbers, or you're looking at, numbers that are published by the government, put this into direct correlation with what you're doing as an organization. So for example, you can say, in this city, there are 100,000 people that go hungry every day, and this is how many people we are able to feed. This is how many people we would like to feed. And just adding some contextual outside data with the direct impact of the work that you're doing helps a lot with, connecting the dots. Beyond that, work with other organizations to better understand your impact. We always recommend kind of like partnering in or, doing competitive research. As businesses, you see a lot. We look at our competitors and we look at their product offering, their solution offering, and we try to, look at their success. We recommend to our nonprofit customers that they do this as well. So if you have, another organization in another city that you're friendly with, start meeting with them on a more regular basis. Do some best practices sharing. If you're both, animal welfare groups, then connect with animal welfare groups in other cities and find out what things worked great for them. Maybe some things that didn't work so great, but using each other to learn and expand, your outreach as an organization. So as a case study, let's look at Austin Pets Alive. We have worked with Austin Pets Alive in, setting up their solution. They're a local animal organization. They're here in Austin. Their mission is to promote and provide resources, education, and programs to eliminate the killing of companion animals. So if I look at their homepage, I see that, July 2011 was their best save record to date at 94%. Also on their homepage, it's clearly stated that their goal is to save 2,000 pet lives. If I go to check out their About Us page, I can very visibly see, they state how many pets were euthanized each month with, and how many lives were affected by their program. Moving on to the donation, I think that they've, created really tangible spots for donors to connect with. So for example, $10 pays for a soft warm blanket, $25 pays for a microchip, $40 can purchase a bag of food. So if you see, they have really connected the dots. They've taken contextual city data, and they've used that to compare to their own data. They've also clearly stated what their goals are, and they've clearly stated how their program impacts the community and awareness. I also know from working with them, and they talk about this on their website, they do have, sister or brother organizations in other cities that they do share best practices and ideas with. I think this is a really great habit. On a monthly basis, they, meet with these organizations. There are several that are involved, and they set aside an hour to talk about, strategies and solutions that are working for them, and also, things that didn't work. There's no need to reinvent the wheel there. But also, talking about what's new on programs, what's new for solutions that they can take back to their organization and learn from. So we've covered a lot of data points throughout this presentation, and you're probably thinking, well, these are great and these are great data points, but how do I really get started tracking with these? We think that, that the best basis for getting tracking with reporting is, establishing what tools you have in place. If you haven't looked into Salesforce.com, we do suggest that you check out their offering. As a company, they're invested in a 1-1-1 integrated philanthropy model, which means as an organization, they are committed to giving 1% of their time, 1% of their product, and 1% of their equity. How this directly impacts you as a nonprofit organization is that you can apply to receive a free grant for 10 licenses to use it for their services. And this would provide you with a complete donor management solution. To expand on this, the folks at Convio have developed Common Ground as a really affordable application that sits on top of the Salesforce platform that packages solutions specifically for the unique needs of nonprofit organizations, and it includes donation management, grant management, event management, social media, and everything in between. Additionally, this package has over 200 pre-written reports which you can easily get started on using in becoming a data-derived organization. Once you have a really good foundation in place, like using a Salesforce.com for your CRM solution or donor database, then we do recommend that you look at other tools that are available out there that integrate with Salesforce and with Common Ground. Next steps are looking at Google Analytics to track your website. You can also evaluate web trends, looking at your email. If you haven't integrated or started using a vertical response or a constant contact, we do recommend this is something that you really consider as an organization. I know personally from working with organizations that if you're using Outlook or Google to send your messages and you're sending a blind carbon copy out to your constituents, then one, a lot of these are being caught in a spam filter, but two, using Outlook or Google doesn't allow you to do the reporting that you might like to be doing as an organization. So for example, being able to see not only that you sent a message, but did somebody open that message? And beyond opening it, did they click on a link in the message? Did they respond to that message? Did they forward it to another friend of theirs? Along with the social method, we recommend looking at Facebook and at Twitter. You may want to there are several free solutions out there that plug these together. But really starting your social media strategy. Social media, we're seeing, has a really big uptick in the 2011, and more people are relying on this as the best way to get information out about their organization and their mission. So with that, let's look at another case study. I work with Writers in the Schools of Texas. They are an organization that engages with children in the pleasure and power of reading and writing. They have after-school programs, adult education programs. They also do summer camps. They keep track of volunteers, donors, program participants, board members. I've been working with them close to 2 years. Before we started working with them, they were using a lot of Excel sheets, but we worked with them to migrate these Excel sheets, which range from their volunteers to some event tracking, to their board member contact information, into using an integrated solution of Common Ground built on the Salesforce platform. And as I mentioned, we're not only tracking everything in Salesforce and Common Ground now, but they're no longer reliant on Excel sheets that were kept on individuals' hard drives. And so instead, as an organization, not only do they no longer have a data silo, but they're all using the same information, and they're all recording their different touch points so they can easily see when somebody last participated in one of their programs, what was their last outreach, any notes that they may have, and they're all sharing that information together. Since they were using Excel before, it was pretty hard for them to cultivate reports on their programs, their outreach, and they spent a lot of time in calling the reports for their board. Sometimes even like, they would spend a week preparing for a board presentation that would last a couple of hours. So one of their big goals was to have really simple reporting and to have all of these reports at their fingertips, so they didn't have to spend a lot of time preparing reports, but they simply, clicked a button to produce them. So we worked with them, and again, they were, they had simple needs since they were just migrating from Excel, and they were just using it as a time-saving effort. Around fundraising, they are tracking donor count. They also look heavily at average donation because, as an organization, they always want to look for ways to increase this average donation. And they look at amount raised, not only on a yearly basis as an organization, but they look at the amount raised for each of their programs. And then once we engaged with them, we really got them interested in looking at LiveBunt. So they have a report now that they look at about once a month to pick out their LiveBunt donors so they can give them, a friendly outreach to remind them, hey, you gave to us last year, and let's talk about what's new and going on at our organization and how you can contribute to this so we can keep expanding our outreach. For communication, they also kept it simple. They look at email rates or email open rates, their Facebook friends, and they also look at page hits. This is important to them on the communication side because they send out a newsletter every other month. So they don't spend a huge time looking at this reporting area, but they did want to be able to chart and compare their emails so they can always refresh their content. So they look at their open rates for, let's say, their January newsletter as well as their March newsletter. And if March had a higher open rate, then they'll examine the content in those two a little bit more. So when they're creating their, next newsletter, they go through and they can pick out which content is most compelling for the people that are receiving their newsletter. They look at their Facebook friends to just see how many folks are following their organization, and they have made a calendar, and they provide updates to their Facebook page and tweets every couple of weeks. Nothing super stringent, but everyone on their organization gets involved with it. And then finally, they look at page hits for communication. And this is important so they can always work to refresh and provide the most compelling content and, use data in their storytelling. So, they look at the pages that are very popular and compare those with the pages that aren't very popular. So they can examine the content across both of those and use that to update and really tell the story of their organization. They do have a lot of programs, so it was important to them to keep a lot of their program reporting at a simplified level. They look at students enrolled. They also look at volunteer count because they want to make sure that at all times they're steadily increasing their volunteers so they can continue to increase their programs and their outreach. The third piece that they look at for programs is inquiries. And they do this so they can see if we sent out a message or we made a Facebook update that had a program on it, which one chose to, generated more inquiries. And this is important so they can use that to craft their content for future programs. So if they've gotten, more inquiries on one particular program, they can use that as a model to develop more programs like that and to tailor more communications around that type that produce those inquiries. On finance, they are not fortunate, to have somebody on their board who is a CPA, so they like to keep it really simple for their accountant, and they look at profit and loss, but they do this at two levels. They look at it from a yearly perspective, what was our profit and loss as an organization, and they also look at it from a program level, so they can decide, how much do we want to continue to invest in these programs, or should we invest in more of these other types of programs because they generate the most impact to our community. They do have a budget, and they look at budget versus actual, not only for the organization, but for programs as well. And then finally, for modeling, they will just look at year over year. They want to make sure that as an organization, they're growing, they are raising more donations, they're developing more programs, but also they're continuing to increase their outreach. So Now that you have some ideas on what information you should be tracking, what's the best way to get started? We really recommend taking stock of your technology. So evaluating where you have data right now. And if you're using things like Excel or maybe an Access database or another solution that doesn't give you the reporting that you need, perhaps checking out some other solutions like the Nonprofit Starter Pack with Salesforce.com, or looking at Convio Common Ground solution to see if it's a fit for your organizational needs and your budget. Going through and looking at, if you are sending out messages from Outlook or from Google, looking at vertical response or constant contact. Vertical response for nonprofit organizations, they give you a grant to send up to 10,000 email messages a month. And constant contact, while they do charge, they have a significant reduction for nonprofit organizations. And most of the organizations we work with pay around $15 a month. So it's a pretty low cost method to increase your email outreach and communication. Once you've taken stock of your technology, really work to define your goals. This is the first step to ensuring that you do have the end in sight. And if you know where you're trying to get, you can make sure as an organization that you're doing everything you can to get there. Once you have your technology defined and your goals defined, just tie the two together. So which technology solutions provide the data I need to meet my specific goals? And then finally, once you do have this technology foundation in place, making sure that you are using the reports and analytics that are provided, that you're setting apart time as part of a campaign to evaluate your progress in real time, evaluate any of your campaigns in real time, so that you can ultimately make sure your campaigns, your programs, your projects all enjoy a level of success. So in conclusion, you want to set your goals. You can't know what target to hit without having a target in mind. Find your balance. You do want to make sure that you can justify the time that it takes compared to the results of reporting that you would see as an organization. 3, track your data in real time. Don't wait until the very end of a campaign or a program or a project, but measure it along the way so you can ensure your success. And really use your data to tell your story. Look at the site for Austin Tech Alive and, see how they're using, all of their numbers to really create a compelling story for their constituents and encourage them how to give, and then tying their direct impact to how the money that they're giving. I think when you're using this to tell your story, it's really helpful to understand, to help others understand why it's critical, and using that data, to motivate and use them to motivate to solve, organizational problems that, or organizational community problems that your organization is working on. We do recommend establishing a shift in culture. Like I said, gut instinct has an amazing spot in every organization. And you always want to make sure that, your passion for doing your mission is driving you. But, start working data and incorporating that data. So you're creating a solid foundation of data and, using that with what you instinctually know. And finally, don't get mired in the details. It's great to use campaign codes. It's awesome to run campaign comparison and to start tracking this in real-time data. But if someone leaves a stack of money at your door, don't spend 30 minutes, debating internally whether it should be for your annual giving campaign or your current, donation campaign. Just put down in a campaign a code and, maybe work on the conversion path that someone took to get to, putting that money at your doorstep. So in conclusion, we thank you very much for your time. We hope that you found this session helpful and informative. Since we do have some time left, Kevin's going to be reviewing any questions that you may have live, and you can put those in the chat window now. If you would like, direct one-on-one follow-up, I am displaying my email information. Feel free to reach out to me, and we can set up some time to chat. We'll also be sending out the email with the slide deck, a thought leadership piece, and the email will also contain a link to this session, which we did record to this day. So thank you, everyone, for your time. We definitely appreciate you joining us today.
All right, hi everybody. Feel free to put questions into the question box on the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar application. We did have one question earlier, as Sandra just mentioned, but just to reiterate, we will have the presentation as well as the recording available online. So I definitely will be able to kind of re-listen to it and get some more of the takeaways from the session.
So to get the ball rolling, Kevin, do you want to talk about how someone could go about receiving a grant for Salesforce to get their 10 free licenses?
Sure. So the Salesforce Foundation has made it extremely straightforward for organizations to receive the grant, as well as just to get information about the grant program in general. So if you go to salesforcefoundation.org, you will find a wealth of information about the program, as well as an outline for the process for receiving the grant. And in one of the steps there's a link directly to an online form where you can put in your information. And one of the important things that they do require is obviously you need to have your proof that you are a nonprofit organization, and typically that is through your filing documents. So a couple questions did come in. So there's a question about whether we as CalPartners offer evaluation services that can help nonprofits review data collection needs and determine how to approach the data collection and use it. By all means, we offer services around evaluating data. One of the important things that we would do when approaching that type of engagement is obviously taking stock of what it is you have, but also taking essentially creating a matrix of what that technology that you have is and how it relates to the goals that you have as an organization. And so you look for intersection points there between having, for instance, the email marketing tools and does that technology support the goals of the organization? And so really that's laying the foundation to identify what is it that you have and what needs is it meeting, as well as what is it that you don't have and what needs are not being met. All right, well, if there are no further questions, then we definitely welcome any direct follow-up. Obviously, Sandra's information is mentioned there on the screen. I can also be contacted directly at kevin@calpartners.com. So either one of us are happy to have a discussion with you and talk further about any questions you have. Again, we thank everybody for your time, and have a great afternoon.